William Henshaw here again, Constitutional Crisis Channel. Another interesting topic, not particularly current events, but the Federal Reserve System. How did we get stuck with it? Well, that goes back a ways. We're going to catch back up to 1913, but you have to go back much earlier than that, to 1792, with the incorporation of the first Bank of the United States at the behest of the first Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton, who was himself an agent of the London Rothschild Bank. By the way, a little aside to this, that Hamilton, as you're probably aware, you may actually have learned this in American history, actually lost a duel to Aaron Burr in which he was shot and killed. Had I been on the jury, if Burr would have come to trial, and he never did, I would have found him guilty of discharging a lethal weapon into a public nuisance. Just a thought. Anyway, First Bank of the United States gets in. They're chartered for 20 years. Central Bank, the lineal predecessor of the Federal Reserve System, and the government gets some powers that they didn't fully use at the time, but they had them, and for 20 years this bank went on, and note, from 1792, what does that take us? 1812. Ever hear of the War of 1812? Now you know the real reason for it, because the government refused to recharter the bank at that time. It took them 5 years, and I'm sad to say this occurred on the watch of President James Madison in 1817 when they got the second bank chartered for 20 years. But nevertheless, they did, and those banks had a fair amount of power, not what the Federal Reserve has now, but they were working on it even then. And this bank expires in 1837 after a vigorous fight by Andrew Jackson, my second favorite president. For this reason, he ran his campaign for re-election in 1832 on the sole issue of getting rid of Nicholas Biddle in the second bank, and he won the election, and he got rid of the bank. Not without some cost, but he did it. A little aside here, you're not going to find in your history books, by the way, is that Biddle did everything he could to bring financial calamity to the United States, and that happened. And among the beneficiaries of this, who knew in advance what was going to happen and took advantage of the knowledge, is a company you probably never heard of. It made a lot of money, called the George T. Peabody Company. You probably know the company that it turned into later, however, the John Pierpont Morgan Guaranty Trust. That's where the bastards made most of their money early on, is from this advanced knowledge they had. So you have the second Bank of the United States. And if we back up a little bit, by the way, I could have started here, but back up even a little bit further to 1783, the Treaty of Paris that purportedly ended the American Revolution and the Revolutionary War. You look at the signatories on this treaty, you can, and you're going to be amazed as who's on it. King George III, which of course he should be, King of England, no problem. King George III, King of Ireland, no problem. King George III, King of France. Think about that one a minute, because didn't we have in the 1770s Benjamin Franklin over there, John Adams, and Thomas Jefferson, and these men were anything if not fools. They had to know what the situation was. If George III was the king in France, weren't they asking him to provide the Americans with the very thing, money and arms, to oppose his armies in the colonies at the time? What the hell is this? Could the fix have been in from the beginning? I'll leave that one to your imagination. I haven't got a firm answer myself, but it raises some very ugly questions. Okay, that said, the Second Bank of the United States goes away in 1837, and we don't have anything in the way of a replacement. The next big deal comes during the war between the states, with the first issuance of greenbacks, which is paper money not backed by anything, and that was during, of course, the presidency of Lincoln, and his then Secretary of the Treasury, Salmon P. Chase, was foursquare in favor of this. And this is important because after the war, Salmon Chase gets appointed as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, and he rules this Act of 1862 unconstitutional and said you couldn't do it. That's a really interesting change of perspective, and I'd like to know more about how that one came about. I'm working on it. If you happen to have information on that, please send that to me at my email here, ckaspari@live.com. I'd love to see it. So you have that, and you have a series of financial panics that take place, particularly in the 1890s, 1893, 1896, And this, by the way, is one of the reasons the Morgan dollars of that era are so valuable, because they didn't mint many of those in these years when we had this quote-unquote crisis going on. And it was a big deal about, the Northerners and the Republicans wanted to go on a standard that was all gold standard. And the Democrats, headed by William Jennings Bryan, who was known for this reason as the silver-tongued orator who ran for president in 1896 and 1900 and lost both times, wanted to keep the silver standard in effect and didn't. By the way, you can Google, you can actually hear William Jennings Bryan give this speech. He recorded it in 1921. It's called the Cross of Gold speech. Well worth listening to. So we had these artificial things going on, and it got so bad in 1907 that Morgan Guaranty Trust created a run on the Knickerbocker Bank and the Great Northern Railroad at the same time by falsely accusing them of being insolvent or about to be. And there was a run on the bank, and a lot of assets, were lost, and a lot of people lost money because of it. That didn't have to happen. But what they did was create a false impression that the American people were just dying to have a central bank. And by God, we're going to give it to you. The first effort was the Aldrich Act in 1909, and it failed miserably. And if that name is familiar to you, you'll know why it failed miserably, because that was Senator Nelson Aldrich from New York, the Wall Street bankers. Now, you may have heard that name more in recent terms than you did in this context if you know who his grandson was named Nelson Aldrich Rockefeller. They could not get it through with that kind of backing. What they had to do was go in 1909 and 1910 to a secret meeting in Jekyll Island. And there's a real good book on that about Jekyll Island written by G. Everett Griffin that you're going to want to read, that tells a lot of details about what exactly happened there. And the sum and substance was they basically recreated the Aldrich plan, but they called it the Federal Reserve Act, and they made a couple of minor concessions in the act because they knew at the time they couldn't get everything they wanted through Congress, and they wouldn't have. By the way, another speech you want to check out about this is Charles A. Lindbergh, who called this the most gigantic money trust on earth. You can Google that, it'll come right up. And by the way, this is Charles A. Lindbergh Sr., who was a representative from Massachusetts, not Lucky Lindy, his son, who was later a supporter of Herr Hitler in Germany. Two different completely threads there, it would seem to me. Nevertheless, they knew if they got this thing enacted that in the fullness of time, they could get in what they wanted, and they did. And they did this in the main by knowing that they controlled the president, Woodrow Wilson, and the Wall Street bankers played it safe in the 1912 election. They supported all three candidates, Wilson, Roosevelt, and Taft. Didn't matter who got in. They wanted Wilson, and that's what they got, with this handheld assistance from Edward Mandell House, who was colloquially known as President House. That's how much power he had. And they got this Federal Reserve Act passed, quote unquote, with some really strange circumstances at the time we won't go into here. But it got passed, and they got what they wanted, and within 10 or 12 years they had amendments to it where they got almost fully all the powers that were wanted in there by Paul Moritz Warburg, better known to you as Daddy Warbucks in the Annie comics in the 1920s, Orphan Annie. So they got it all in there, and that's where this stuff comes from, and where they get it, and it turned into what they said in 1941, with the then chairman of the Federal Reserve, Marriner S. Eccles, was in Congress in front of Congressman Patman, and he asked him, how did you get that $2 billion, and this is 1941, to buy up all these securities and whatever, and he said, well, we created it. And Patman says, out of what? Eccles says, out of the right to create credit money. Patman says, and there's nothing behind it, is there? Eccles says, that's right, there's nothing behind it. If there were no debt, there would be no money. That's the system we put into, and what they're trying to foist off on us. Now, what they don't realize, for those of us smart enough to know, and I'm going to teach you in a longer video on this, you look at 12 U.S.C. 411, that's about the Federal Reserve Act, and you read that, and this is another one of these statutes with no case law on it. Isn't that interesting? But the way I read it is that if Congress had power to delegate this authority to the Federal Reserve, and I don't think they do have it, but if they did, they got that power from the members of the sovereign body politic of the nation and republic who created all government. If we didn't have those powers, Congress didn't have them. So the net effect here is, if they can delegate them, we have the same powers as the Federal Reserve Bank, and we don't need any legislative enactment to do the same things. I'm working hot and heavy on that one right now, but you can see where that's going to go. If we can basically create our own quote-unquote money, which is what they claim to be able to do, it must be from the same source, and we are the source. So this is going to get a whole lot more interesting in the next year, trust me, and we'll follow up with the longer video. Thank you.